something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong.
Edwin Stanton killed Abraham Lincoln with John Wilkes Booth and Andrew Johnson. There now exists enough tangible evidence to hang Stanton right next to Booth. Now, I'm no legal expert, but a really good lawyer like Stanton may well have gotten Andrew Johnson off, but I still think historians have to go with the idea that Andrew Johnson was the link between the two. Now, I'm only really doing this for you 10 subscribers out there, who I'd like to thank from the bottom of my heart. If you look on YouTube, it looks like I've got hundreds and hundreds of views, and actually, most people just turn it on for about 10 seconds and turn it off when they see how amateurish these things are. So it's only about a dozen of you actually listen to them all the way through, and I appreciate that from the bottom of my heart. But I think we have to understand that Stanton killed Lincoln if we want to understand what the war was really about and what the outcome was and why it ended the way it did. If you don't understand that, frankly, you do not understand the war. Most teachers of popular history are going to say that I am talking crazy. But in Sherman's judgment, Stanton eliminated Lincoln. He was closer in time to these events and knew all the parties intimately. I suggest y'all stop and read this whole thing, you serious historians. But just to hit the high points here, he said he expressed a desire to dig deeper into the diabolical plot. He charged Stanton with a deadly malignity. Okay, Stanton was guilty, in Sherman's opinion. During Washington's historic Grand Review of the Armies held in May 1865 to celebrate the end of the war, politicians and generals congratulated Sherman as he made his way to his seat. But when Secretary of War Edmund Stanton offered his hand, Sherman refused to take it. In front of the press, in front of the public, in front of everybody, he made a big show of being rude to the man. Stanton and Sherman had clashed earlier. In January of 1865, a couple of weeks after Sherman marched his troops into Savannah, Georgia, Stanton sailed down from Washington for a visit. Like much of what Stanton did, the trip involved a nominal objective and one or more ulterior purposes. Officially, Stanton came to collect the 25,000 bales of cotton that Sherman had captured with the city, but that might have been accomplished by the Treasury Department official who accompanied him. Acting Adjutant General Edward D. Townsend, part of Stanton's entourage in Savannah, admitted that collecting the cotton was only an excuse. Sherman, who had waged war as viciously as any of the radical generals he scorned, always maintained that his hostility would vanish the moment the rebels laid down their arms, and his agreement with Johnston confirmed as much. Word of the assassination had not reached them when they first met, and Sherman seemed deeply imbued with the spirit of magnanimity that Lincoln had expressed during a late March interview with him and Grant. With his Confederate counterpart, Sherman outlined a complete blueprint for Reconstruction, including a general amnesty, the restoration of political rights, and the preservation of state governments. Okay, that's Lincoln's idea. That's what Lincoln told him to do. When word of Johnston's surrender reached Washington, Stanton gathered the president and cabinet members that night, and they unanimously rejected Sherman's surrender agreement with Johnson as intruding on the prerogatives of the chief executive and on those of Congress. Stanton waxed especially vitriolic on Sherman. Later that night, he composed an order for Grant to proceed to Sherman's headquarters and direct operations against the enemy, intimating that Sherman would be removed from command at the moment of victory. Of course, that would have required a clash between the Army of the Potomac and Sherman's army. The men were fiercely loyal to him. Stanton was seriously suffering from megalomania at this point. I am indebted for most of the information on this video from the research done by Otto Eisenspiel, who Wikipedia says was born June 16, 1880 and died December 7, 1963, about when I was 7 years old. Okay, he was non-biased and objective. He had plenty of money being an executive in the American oil industry. Okay, he's best known for his 1937 book on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Mr. Eisenspiel was the kind of historian who dug into archives, talked to witnesses, and visited the children of deceased witnesses, looking for letters and other papers. His very analytical mind came to the conclusion that Stanton was guilty, even though he admitted that no concrete proof existed as of yet. So extensive was his research that historian Ralph Newman relied heavily on it in these two Civil War classics, The American Iliad, The Epic Story of the Civil War, and The Civil War as We Lived It. As you can see, Bruce Canton signed off on it. And if Bruce Canton's approval means more to me than the approval of all the current living historians put together, with the possible exception of Ed Barris. The best way to explain Mr. Eisenspiel's perspective is to let him explain it to you. For the people that really have trouble reading, I'll go ahead and try to paraphrase part of this on down. For most of you serious historians, I suggest you stop and read this part. But basically, he said that he failed in his duty to protect the president's life after he knew it was dangerous. I mean, they'd just already tried to explode a bomb underneath part of the White House. Okay, Lincoln asked for special help from Major Eckert, and Stanton wouldn't give it to him. Said they were busy that night, and they really weren't. Okay, and then there was a lot of proof of negligence on the part of Parker, who showed up late drunk and then kind of went back to the bar and got drunk after he showed up. He wasn't in trouble at all, even though there was actually a hearing by the police force into his behavior. The record of that hearing was kind of taken by Stanton. Okay, he took special pains to have Grant removed. I mean, Grant was going to go that night, and we can see now that it was Stanton who stopped him from going. Okay, he directed the pursuit of Booth from the moment he got there. He and Father Neptune, Gideon Wells, knew that it was Booth, but he allowed Booth to get away, and he shouldn't have. If it hadn't been for his broken leg, he would have got away. I mean, he had access to the telegraphs. He could have put the news out in the papers and had him stopped, but he didn't do it. Okay, he kept Booth's name from the public for about 3 hours. Okay, and from the beginning, he was saying Confederate leaders had did it. He had already decided who the guilty party was and decided all he had to do was prove it, and this is what he was telling the press. Okay, the War Department recalled to Major O'Brien when he was in the proximity of the fugitives. In other words, the Army had just about ran them down when Stanton ordered them to stop. Okay, the actual pursuit and subsequent capture of Booth was by Stanton's picked men, and they killed him. Okay, he goes on about the mistreatment of the prisoners, and that you can find in a lot of other sources. But he says here that it gave Stanton a kind of the dictatorial power to do whatever he wanted with the South. Ouch. Historians dismiss Eisenspiel because he said that Stanton was trying to prolong the war. Okay, Eisenspiel was mistaken. I don't think he understands, and that's what a lot of historians say. He just doesn't understand the temper of the war and the situation at the time. But his mistake still points us to the truth, because the man, he actually had understood what was going on, He just didn't have enough information like we have now, and so he missed it. But Stanton's micromanagement kept the Confederate spies in the War Department apprised of the U.S. Army's every move, and they were quickly getting that information to Richmond, and particularly useful in the Virginia theater. Okay, you can read this. I mean, the man is really close to understanding what's going on, and it just seems like every time Stanton makes a move, it's the wrong move. And he sees that. He lays out a good case for it, but it wasn't intentional. It's like in Vietnam, Linebacker 2. American bombing had been totally ineffectual for about 3-4 years there. And finally, when they quit having to verify and get authorized targets out of Washington, then they've actually became very effective and knocked the North Vietnamese out and forced them to the table for a couple of years. So really, I think it's important to understand that we need to learn these lessons of history. You can't micromanage a general from the Capitol. It's politicians trying to tell professional soldiers what to do, and he was doing that, and we should have learned our lesson. Okay, I'm going to try in my humble way to make a quick synopsis of his book. Okay, he talked about the motive. I mean, we already covered that with Sherman. I mean, power. Okay, he talked about Stanton's character. Basically none. He's a psychopath. He talks about the targets. Even then, he understood that Johnson was never a target. And then, of course, he talked about the guards and the escapes, the reason the bridges were open. And then the manhunt, he's talking about L.C. Baker, the chief detective that was sent down there to kill Booth. And he doesn't think much of Colonel Baker, eventually General Baker. And so that's why the movie that made about Ehrenspiel's book in 1977 has Baker playing the heavy. However, we know now that Baker was trying to save his life, trying to save Lincoln's life. He was not the heavy. He was telling the truth in his accusations in his fight with Stanton. Of that, now there can be no doubt. Okay, he goes into who was accused. People think that's a slam dunk, but it wasn't. They arrested hundreds of people, and many of them absolutely had as much to do with it as, say, Mary Surratt. And then they that's where they talk about the perpetrators, between the people who were actually involved and those that were charged. He goes into that in great detail. And then, of course, he talks about the way that the prisoners were tortured, and the trial, which was a kangaroo court, said at the time people hadn't been treated that way since the Middle Ages, not in the English-speaking world. And he talks about how the sentence was taken real quickly. Okay, he didn't have at that point Azeroth's statement. Azeroth's statement was not admitted into evidence and has been hiding for all these many years. Okay, if he had had that, he'd have known that actually Miss Surratt was a Confederate operative. Okay, if he had had Conrad's confession, he would have really put that into perspective, understanding the whole thing from top to bottom was a Confederate Cavalry Intelligence Service operation, and that she was just one of the many players. And what Ehrenspiel is trying to say is only those people that were in contact with Booth that day were executed, and all the many people that were in contact with him after that kind of got a free ride. Okay, there are territorial records that show that have only been uncovered recently by a man ironically named L.C. Baker, who found some records in Nebraska that in some people's cabinets in their attic, excuse me, from a Mr. Morton who had connections with a fellow named Ficklin, who was one of those people that was in custody and arrested immediately after the trial, immediately after the murder, but wasn't tried. That gives a whole lot more strength. I think Mr. Ehrenspiel had that. He would have put things in better perspective. Okay, what he did not have, was the FBI forensics on the diary showing a very sophisticated manipulation, actually taking the booklets out, books that are bound inside the finding, and resewing them. That's absolutely what happened. Okay, So Stanton is absolutely, without a doubt, guilty of tampering with evidence. He did not have Mr. Frank Varney's research. He's a professor in North Dakota who's gone and looked a lot of records, particularly in his research on Rosecrans, who he has a lot of respect for, and who I agree is probably one of the better Union generals who was a victim of Stanton's wrath. He has found evidence that, Rosecrans sent one of his staff officers directly to see Lincoln because his efforts to contact Lincoln to tell him that he had uncovered evidence through his Canadian contacts. You understand, Rosecrans was pretty sharp. He had agents and an intelligence service working in conjunction in Montreal with the Confederate Cavalry Intelligence Service office there that had paid for by Memphis funds. And Mr. Varney has actually shown us that he was was arrested by Stanton and held and charged with being out of his military department without permission, which is basically ridiculous. But Rosecrans was trying to warn Lincoln that he was going to get killed. Okay, Mr. Ernsfield didn't know all that. Now, Mr. Ernsfield finished work on his book in 1937. In 1953, the last of the classified material was released. By that point, he had moved on. He was writing for the journals, and he was writing with Mr. Newman, the other histories beyond that. And it wasn't fresh on his mind. And he really, I don't know if he actually went through it, but I think he should have had it sooner. And he compared it to some of like incidental data that he went through. You see things that in other parts of your research that you don't realize are relevant until you see them again. So it's just the idea that Stanton had that stuff classified, all the material of the War Department, until 1953 it was kept in secret, means there's something a little fishy going on. As far as money, where we're talking about the motive of money, this goes beyond the ability to accumulate money. This goes to the power to create money. More power than any person has ever had in their hands, probably in the history of the world up until that point, except maybe Queen Victoria, but we're talking about potential power that this man held. Paper currency was introduced by the United States federal government following the outbreak of the Civil War. These notes were in issue between 21st of August, 1862, and the 15th of February, 1876. He makes kind of a pretty picture on there. I think I like Washington better, but whatever. Okay, this is from a Copperhead cartoon. There are always a bunch of people in the North that oppose Stanton. Just because you're a Yankee doesn't mean you're stupid. Okay, here he's wearing the clothes of a Roman patrician in ceremonial garb, and he's pointing to the Confiscation Act number. Okay, nothing was printed did not meet his guidelines. If you went outside his guidelines, you went to jail. There was a few newspapers, like I said, in Chicago, where when he went to close them, such a large crowd gathered that he backed down because they had just gone through the riots in New York City where the anti-war crowd had burned down half the city and killed a lot of people, and he didn't want that to happen in Chicago, so he backed down. So there was a McClellan press that survived throughout the war. And this is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that says that Stanton killed Lincoln. Stanton was Buchanan's attorney general and the one that insisted that he oppose secession. He then went back into private practice, representing, among others, Secretary of War Simon Cameron. His law firm's primary client were the Massachusetts mills. Bear with me a moment and let's explain what that implies. Back in the beginning, due to the Lowell's Mill early success, many new mills and mill towns, just like it, began to sprout up along the rivers across Massachusetts and New England. Around 45 mill towns were established during the Industrial Revolution just in Massachusetts alone. By 1850, the Boston Associates, including Edmund Dwight, Kirk Boot, Patrick T. Jackson, and others, controlled most of the entire New England's large cotton mills. Their names could be found on the board of directors or as major stockholders in virtually all of the cotton factories of the day. They managed or owned one-fifth of the entire U.S. textile industry, with a complex array of interlocking directorates. These men control production by exchanging information on cost, posting similar bids for raw cotton, and by attempting to fix the price of finished goods. They monopolized the region's water power sites, had substantial interest in the subsidiary manufacture of textile machinery, and often built and rented out houses to the workers. To gain access to new markets and to support new profitable ventures that would reduce their risk, they invested in the first railroads in the state, holding interest in one-third of the state's railroads by the late 1840 mileage. By 1848, they possessed 40% of Boston bank stock and 38% of the state insurance industry. The investment pursuits of Boston capitalist elite helped make Massachusetts first in the nation in the high proportion of workers involved in manufacturing and non-agricultural activities. This comes from the history of express companies and the origin of American railroads. I think that's important because it shows how the express companies were born in the railroads. When the Boston Manufacturing Company formed the Merrimack Manufacturing Company in 1822, Kirk Boot was sent to the Lowell to be the first agent and treasurer, since the current agent, Patrick L. Jackson, had to remain in Waltham. Under Boot's leadership, the Merrimack Company was extremely profitable. When he became the proprietor of Locks and Canals, the organization that controlled the canal water and land was separated from the Merrimack Manufacturing Company. Booth became the agent. In this position, he sold the water power the Merrimack Company did not use, allowing many other firms to open up operations in Lowell. Okay, I'm not saying these are bad people. I'm just saying that we've got to look at this. Chartered by the state of Massachusetts, the Boston and Lowell Railroad Company of 1830 started with $500,000 from Kirk Boot and Patrick Jackson. The Boston Taunton Railroad Company of 1831 started with $1 million from Edwin Dwight. Of course, they grew rich, taking the enormous amounts of cotton from Boston to the mills. They also actually started the first express agency. Of course, this needed government sanction. The first parcel express agency in the United States is generally considered to have been started by William F. Hardin in 1839. And it began trips between New York and Boston, Massachusetts, as a courier transporting small parcels, currency, and other valuables. It's kind of like the armored car of the day. The Express was a favorite institution of Abraham Lincoln. His cabinet was for it, and to Secretary of War Mr. Stanton, it was particularly useful. When the Union fleet captured Hilton Head, South Carolina, it was he who planted there the Express and gave it special favor both on land and sea, flying the New York route. I landed there and can attest to the friendly offices of Mr. Stanton and Admiral Dahlgren. The Express was always welcome on board Navy flagships. You'd think, he had better things to do than go running around establishing companies for his ex-clients, but he didn't. The Bay State's colorful Edward Atkinson, variously a prominent abolitionist, cotton mill industry leader, and weapons supplier to John Brown, persuaded Lincoln to liberalize between the lines trading. Later in the war, Atkinson urged that New Englanders be given Texas lands to raise cotton, utilizing former slaves for labor. The question about whether ex-slaves would accept the scheme, he answered that if they declined, they should be allowed to starve, and so removed the Negro question, but still we must have cotton. Among others, General Edward Canby wrote to the President that cotton traders follow the track of the army and traffic in its blood, with all the baseness of Judas Iscariot, but without the remorse. You gotta like Canby. I'm sorry, but he's kind of one of my favorite Yankees. With or without cotton, the South was doomed. but the robust trade in cotton let it live a little longer and fight harder than it might have otherwise. After the fall of Vicksburg, the Union captured Memphis, a major cotton port on the Mississippi River. 18 New England textile manufacturers petitioned Congressman Samuel Hooper of Massachusetts to reestablish trade. Okay, slaves were similarly affected. After reporting that federal troops had confiscated his corn and his hogs, a southern planter sought permission to sell cotton to buy a sizable quantity of provisions to feed the 100 slaves wishing to remain on his plantation. Otherwise, he said, he would have to turn them over to federal authorities because he did not want them to starve. This comes from Trading with the Enemy by Phil Lee. Okay, the black people there had already had a good taste of the tender mercies of the Union Army, especially after General Williams abandoned them above Vicksburg. They would really kind of rather stay home than go get some of that Yankee freedom. Lincoln, Seward, and others believed that Europeans might intervene if their textile industries were overly deprived of the commodity, and so this decision was made to quietly allow intersectional trade in cotton. Grant came face to face with the dangerous consequences of a surprising fact of the Civil War, the semi-illicit trade in cotton between North and South. Northern merchants paid well and often in gold for the Southern crop. The Confederates then used the gold to buy new weapons, sometimes from clandestine suppliers in northern or occupied cities like Cincinnati and Memphis. Grant soon found himself confronting rebel troops sustained by such trade, including cavalry armed with modern breech-loading carbines. I refer you back to the snipers at Fort Pillow and their Whitworth carbines that they were using, the sniper rifles. Yeah, it's a real thing. Forrest was getting all kind of fancy stuff out of the North. It's well known that British textile manufacturers relied heavily on Southern cotton for their raw materials, but the New England mills ranked second. They wanted to be number one. Consequently, by the autumn of 1862, Northern cotton speculators were regularly infiltrating front lines seeking to acquire the commodity needed in Britain and New England. Okay, I'll get back to the murder in here a second. I know it seems like I'm going far afield, but remember who's in control of this canal board. And we can see now that these canals are not just for transportation, they're to facilitate manufacturing, to regulate the flow of water. And this is going quite extensive government expense in the North to develop these canals. By 1860, the canal system in the North had grown like a weed. However, it was benefiting the upper South. You see them, they even have them down in Virginia now. These were to facilitate the economy of the entire area. And this kind of shows, in my opinion, why the upper South was a little bit more pro-union, why they were the last ones to leave. It's all about the economy, people. The mill owners and their bankers were behind this rapid expansion of railroads in the North. Okay, this required government patronage for the proper industrial growth. The South was all about railroads, but why build a railroad when you can float your cotton to market faster just going down the river? Okay, the Northerners were working on the railroad. Samuel Clemens was learning to drive a steamboat. In this, the North was correct. The need for greater centralized authority was important for efficiency and industrial growth. In the South, the railroad gauges didn't match. Okay, and this concept of union is correct, and this is what the Union Army fought for, and in this, they were righteous. Much of the fighting, and this is much dismissed a lot, but a lot of the fighting was about government patronage to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The southern route is shorter and actually logistically much easier and would have been a lot cheaper to build. But you can see that it only took the Union Army, or the Union, 4 years to make the Union Pacific Railroad. It took 4 times longer, 16 years, before they got around to making the Southern Pacific. The Southern Pacific was in the control of Connecticut and Massachusetts owners. I mean, Southerners didn't build it. But it retarded the growth of the Southern economy relative to the Northern. This is kind of what Stanton had in mind. Okay, this is the mastermind of the murder, Samuel L.M. Barlow. Well, y'all can stop and read this. I'd suggest you do. But he's the one that ended up in control of the railroads after the end of the war. I once thought that Gould was the New York parties that were behind the murder, but this man was beat Gould. I mean, Gould had contracts with Grant about gold. The very first law that Grant passed when he got into office was a favor to Jay Gould. He's not the guilty party. He didn't have that much power as the war started. He made most of his money during the war as a profiteer. This guy, Mr. Barlow, had the control from the beginning, and actually more control than Gould. He's the guy that's forcing Stanton to go into war. He's got his fingers on the pulse of the banks and the railroads. And he's the guy who's supporting insurrection and violence in the South, financing John Brown and literally making war on the South from the beginning. He's the one who's behind killing Lincoln at the end, because his priorities, the unionization and centralized authority under his control, was what the war was all about to begin with. Lincoln's conscience allowed mission creep to alter the war into a moral crusade that was as contrary to the goals of industry as secession itself. For that reason, Samuel Barlow demanded that he either agree to radical Reconstruction or be eliminated. Now, Stanton, whose usual methods was character assassination, that he used against McClellan, Rosecrans, Fitzjohn Porter, and tried against Sherman, was not an option for the very popular Lincoln. So Stanton, who lacked a conscience, set him up to be murdered. Okay, I'm trying to keep these things to 30 minutes apiece, folks. If y'all will bear with me in part 2, I will actually start getting into the nitty-gritty of the evidence.
Looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. There was a band